Fishing like a local isn't just about catching fish. It's about connecting with the environment and the people who call it home. It's about hearing the stories and traditions that have been passed down for generations and sharing unforgettable moments with the people you meet along the way. Fishing like a local is having an experience that stays with you forever. And with Fishing Booker, you can experience it too, no matter where you are. Discover your next adventure on Fishing Booker.
If you hunt enough, you learn the truth. What you seek speaks a language and knows it well. That's why every Primo's call for everything you hunt is made the right way. We sweat every detail so you get more out of every hunt, and nothing leaves our hand until we know it'll work in yours. Because we don't just make the world's best calls, we speak the language. Primos.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Western Hunting Hub podcast. Today, we've got on Mr. Larry Weishuhn from Sportsman Life on Carbon TV, Dallas Safari Club, Campfire Podcast, wildlife biologist, writer, speaker. Larry, you've got a lot of hats. Thanks for being here.
I'm truly honored, Clint. It's great to be with you. And you're right. I do wear many hats, but all of them are brown, and almost all of them are brown felt. So
that's outstanding. I had a specific question for this. Out of all those hats, I remember watching you with your revolver as a youngster, chasing down Texas whitetails. That's the memory that sticks in my brain the most. But out of all those hats, if one of those could just pay the bills, and you didn't make any more, you didn't make any less, but one of those paid the bills, what one of those hats would it be and why?
oh my gracious. Now that is a tough question for me because I dearly love what I do and all the things that I get to do. I absolutely can't wait to get up for to go do in the morning. Probably, if you got right down to it, it would be that of being a writer, the outdoor writing that I did, because it allowed me to be very creative in so many different ways, and it allowed me to experience a lot of different places. The TV stuff was important, and the biology side was important as well too. But I really think when you get right down to it, the answer to your question would probably be the writing I've been able to do.
Oh, very good. That's why I do audio stuff. I can't write. I can't.
I bet you can. If you can speak, you can write.
Yeah, and then I don't do the video stuff. So really, yeah, I like to keep just the audio stuff going for now.
Yes, sir. And that is fun. I enjoy that part of it as well, obviously.
This is my cheat for, instead of journaling, it's come learn things from experts like yourself, and it's there forever. I can listen, my grandkids can listen, it's there, and we get to enjoy these stories and conversations. So I'm glad you get to be a part of that. What's your fall shaking out to be?
We've got a bunch of things coming up. I know you guys spent a lot of time hunting in the West, and my first hunt this year is a moose hunt up in British Columbia with the Lee brothers, and or is it? I'm sorry, Ron Fleming is who I'm going with. I can't. I can't remember the exact name of his outfit, but we're hunting out of Smithers and hunting for moose primarily. But beyond that, I've got a bunch of hunts coming up too for whitetail deer, including going to Finland this year in November. Finland's got a pretty good whitetail deer population.
Really?
And I've been asked to come over to see if we can actually rattle up a whitetail buck in Finland. So that'll be in November. I'm looking forward to that. In between all that, I've got a bunch of whitetail hunts coming up in Texas and Oklahoma and a few other places. And then possibly maybe still going up to Alberta again. Alberta is one of my favorite whitetail destinations, particularly that last week of December. And then once we finish with the DSC convention in Atlanta this year in January, I'll be headed to Durango, Mexico to hunt Coues deer. So going to be a really busy year, and I've got a lot of great hunts I'm looking forward to, and spending time with some very special people as well, along with those hunts.
Is there whitetails elsewhere in the world that you just wouldn't think of like that? Is that an isolated population? Is it?
Apparently this population was introduced sometime probably in the 1920s or 1930s, and they do take upwards of, I think, 100,000 whitetail each year in Finland. Now there's some whitetail deer scattered elsewhere. I've hunted them a little bit down on the South Island of New Zealand. I've seen them down there, but we were hunting a buck and just could not find any kind of buck when we were there. So I know those two places have whitetail deer, and then of course we've got different species of whitetail deer that really kind of run all the way down into, of course, even into northern Alberta and northern British Columbia. I've seen them up on the Prophet Musqueam area up in there. And then they run down into the central and the northern part of South America. So, pretty much the North American big game species. But as I mentioned, Finland and New Zealand both have populations.
Well, they're so adaptable that I suppose you could put them anywhere and they'd try to figure it out for the most part. They're just abundant in the US.
You're exactly right. Pardon me.
If I could ask you something, those whitetail that are in Finland, how do they compare to the States whitetail? Is there size difference? Is there rack difference? What do you see as?
Well, it's a new adventure for me, so I'm not real sure. I will find out when I get there, but it's my understanding that probably they were brought in from possibly the area around Maine. So I'm assuming their bodies typically in Maine are big bodies and occasionally have big antlers, but generally I'm assuming that their bodies are probably going to be in that neighborhood where they probably field dress right at about 170 to 200 kind of thing. And I may be totally wrong. They may be just 130 field dress kind of deer.
Is that
Like to see.
shoot, yeah, I had a great question follow up and it just left me. So we'll
Sorry
just
about that.
no, it was in response to yours, Mark. So the antler growth stuff is something that perplexes me, and I know a lot of questions usually comes in around the spring and summer growth stuff, but I have some later season questions as well. Um, and I always nerd out about this as a naturalist myself, an educator. I enjoy teaching people about antler growth and talking to them about it because it's just a phenomenon that's unreal, especially in elk, that when they've shed their antlers, they have so short of a time to grow all that. And what I tell people is the second fastest growing tissue in the world, second to tumors, but just unreal how fast that can grow, and the densities in it and the strength in it is just so varying, and it's fascinating. So, but my first one is just on the spring and summer growth. I had a question from a Instagram follower that asked about spring and summer, early and late monsoons in the summer. Just kind of curious about some of those different time periods that you get moisture. Like right now in South Dakota, we are getting some solid moisture. The hills look great, the prairies look great. We're getting good spring moisture. I don't think we need to talk much about spring moisture. You get good green up, you get some good early growth. But saying that summertime, after we've had that initial bit of recovery from the rut and the winter time, you get early summer and late summer moisture. What's the most important? How does that affect antler growth? What's your thoughts on summer monsoons?
We're going to take a step back because a very critical period is what kind of body condition that animal is in when he sheds those antlers. If he's in a good body condition and a good nutritional condition, he's probably going to have pretty good antlers. So that's really kind of a critical start time period when it comes to antlers. Now, the summertime, by the time we get into July, such as we are right now, having good range and all that really makes a healthy animal. But for the most part, it's probably coming a little bit late as far as real antler development is concerned. Those early stages of antler development is when nutrition is so very critical in terms of what those antlers are going to look like that coming fall. So good spring rains, yeah. Summer rains, yeah. Good moisture and good body condition and food availability during the late winter, very, very important.
So you've got, what would you say are some of those primary conditions that are going to have a good growth year? Say you just came out of a average, let's go with average, a winter. What are some of those primary things? Because I think about that with turkeys. Our Merriam's turkeys here in the Black Hills of South Dakota, that one is getting a lot of really good uh, attention right now because they're rebounding. We've had some great springs. We've had mild winters. We haven't had a nasty cold spring and summer hail things that can hurt poults and the biologists are saying, man, we're lining up. Things are good. Things are good. Things are good. Let's just keep at it, and those numbers are going to be looking really good. And I can list three or four with turkeys, but what are those things that come with whitetails that say this, 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 this?
Again, like I said, I hate to come back to this same
Go,
thing, but it
go.
really depends upon what kind of body condition they come out of the rut. It takes antler development takes second seat to body up until the time those deer are trying to. And again, you got to throw in the situation of, are they mature deer? Are they immature deer? Y'all's deer up in the northern country, whether it's whitetail or mule deer, pretty much do not body mature until they're 3.5 years of age. So antler development takes back seat. So if that buck is still growing body and he's on a marginal diet, antlers are not going to be that great because the body always takes precedence, kind of thing. Once that deer matures in y'all's part of the country at 3, in our part of the country farther south, 4.5, then anything that's not required for pure maintenance of that deer can be turned into antler development. So that becomes a very critical thing to look at as well too, is looking at the age and maturity of that animal, and then just the availability of it on a day-to-day basis. What we've learned over the years when it comes to nutrition is that those areas that have a fairly level line of protein and energy being very, very important in all this, as well as some of the trace minerals like calcium, phosphorus, and iron, and zinc, and manganese, and all those other kind of things. The straighter the line that is on a day-to-day basis for that nutritional level, the better the health of the animal and the better the antler development is going to be. So those things become very critical as far as I'm concerned, of trying to have that animal on a good, healthy basis every day and not just on a seasonal basis.
What are some of those myths you like to debunk a little bit when you hear some random hunter say something about, oh, we're gonna have a good year, or they're just not gonna, it's not a good year? Anything you come across your desk that you're just like, yeah, that's not how science works?
Well, to me, the one thing I learned a long time ago is that whenever you make a very definite statement about white-tailed deer or elk or mule deer or turkeys or anything, they're going to make a definite liar out of you, kind of thing, because there's always circumstances. There's that individual thing that some animals do better on certain diets than they do others. There's some that are much more efficient at taking energy from things that the average deer might not be able to procure enough to do anything. But when it comes to me, again, I guess it just kind of comes down to the local area as far as debunking different things. Uh, it's maybe not so much debunking things as coming up with new sayings, kind of thing. Like in our part of the country, particularly deep South Texas, we have very high protein levels on a day-to-day basis. We have very few acorns. We have very few energy producing items for those animals to eat. And I think that if you're going to debunk anything, I think it's to say that protein by itself is the most important thing when it comes to antler development. We did research several years ago through ADM, Mormon Mineral, through Texas A&M University, and we found that in the research that we did with those deer being from the southern part of the state of Texas, those deer required a fair amount of energy, and the more energy that we could get into their diet, the better their antlers going to be. And that had to do to a point probably more of the health of the animal than anything. So when somebody says, oh my God, they need nothing but protein, well, that to me is maybe the thing that you debunk and saying, nope, energy is every bit as important as what is protein. Now you need the presence of a good protein levels and of digestibility protein of 12% or better. But energy is really important. Don't overlook that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly kind of answer I was looking for. Something in that neck of the woods.
Well, good.
Say, and then when we talk about having a good growth year, elk or mule deer, um, and maybe we ought to narrow that down. Let's just go with some Colorado mule deer. I've got a lot of listeners in Colorado.
Yes, sir.
If we have that good year, and you've just got your steady growth in a deer, how big of a swing can that make, either inches wise or think? Let's just grab a year, if a buck was a 140 this year and he was probably going to be a 145, 150 the next year. I don't know. How drastic can that be on an average year? And again, I know, but going back to that body condition is everything. Um, but in my mind, when I think of those antlers and you harvest a deer, it's like, well, last year is probably just a little smaller, and you just think of that perfect scale going up, but it's tough to see, and I don't get to see the same deer year after year after year. I'm not one of those guys that is always hunting the same ground, getting to see that stuff over and over and over and again. So I'm curious to know how big of a range that can be of a change from year to year that's not just age and growth. Has there been studies on that? And
From the latest things that I've seen is that for years we thought mule deer probably had their best antlers at 9 and 10 years of age, but research that's been done in the Texas Panhandle, now that's that particular deer, they found that their antlers were really good starting at about 4 to about 6 to 7 years. So that's one thing to consider. The growth that I've seen years ago, I took care of a ranch up in northwestern Colorado. It was where the Yampa and the Little Snake came together up on the north end of Dinosaur National Monument. Now, most of those animals were transitory, if you will, or migratory. I've been up there years ago and seen as many as 200 to 300 deer come out of the north, coming off that red desert country and some of the mountain country in Wyoming. But we had a resident number of deer on that property, and as it worked out, evidently some cowboy when this fawn was small and had done a swallow fork or split his ear, so he was on both ears, so he was very recognizable, and he stayed there on the property. And once that deer got to be mature to where he was like 5 years of age, we had several, as you mentioned, just kind of regular type of years in terms of depth of snowfall, the amount of snowfall. Nothing really changed on the ranch as far as range conditions due to livestock grazing, or that was back before we had so many elk up in that area, kind of thing. And I watched that buck in 1 year put on probably about close to 30 inches of antler. And that was when he went to a 6-year-old deer. Now he stayed at that level pretty much. He was right at a 200 class deer for 2 or 3 years there, and then finally I lost track of him. I don't know if he got taken by a mountain lion, whether or he died, of natural causes. But then there was another deer that we watched that stayed around the headquarters, and that buck would put on it in a year, maybe from the time that he got to be mature, he might put on a grand total of maybe 6 to 10 inches total on his antler development. He was one of those deer that just did not seem to get much bigger. Today he'd have probably been considered a good buck because he was probably in the 170s. But he stayed at that. He never really got any bigger, and he didn't get any smaller for about 4 years there. So again, it's one of those very individual things. But even in a regular year, that deer maybe he didn't get run down quite as far during the rut. Maybe that's what it was. So he recovered quickly, or maybe there was some little plant there that cycled through 1 or 2 of those years that for whatever reason wasn't there at the rest of the time, because that can happen in a lot of the western areas where you have a plant that shows up for whatever reason, it's there for a year or two and then it disappears again. So they can make substantial jumps or they might just stay the same. It's just an individual kind of thing rather than as a whole. As a whole, you can probably say that in an average year, if that deer goes from a 5 to 6 years old, you ought to put in maybe say 10 to 12 inches of additional antler development. And I'm not talking about spread. I'm talking about actual bone growth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Larry, I got one for you. So in the Midwest, we trail cam our deer. Most of the time people are able to pattern their deer. I'm sure it's a lot like Texas. Have you ever seen it where you have a buck and let's just say that he's a 4-year-old deer, so he's mature, and he drops an antler growth from the previous year? Do you ever see that where they drop and then they keep gaining again?
I have seen a lot of that has to do with how active they are during the rut and how far they get run down. I have seen deer that we had that were marked. Maybe they had an ear tag, and I'm talking about wild deer. I'm not talking about pin deer or anything like that. But several of the places years ago, we would tag deer so that we could come up with known age jaws and to see what kind of tooth wear there was in that kind of habitat. And there were several bucks that I remember that either as a 3 or 4-year-old that might be 150, 160. They rutted real hard that year. And that next year they'd be multi-pointed. And then next year they'd be the prettiest little 120, 125 8-point you've ever seen. And left alone that following year, when they didn't rut quite so hard, guess what? The nutrition being equal all the way throughout this for the most part. That next year, after being a 125, when they didn't rut quite so hard, they went back to being a 150, 160 or even better. You hear a lot about, and particularly in our part of the country, about people talking about culling. I've got ranches that I've dealt with in the past that they culled everything that was 8-point once they got any kind of age on them. And yet what I've seen so very often, I just described, a lot of times it's those 3 to 4-year-old deer that do most of the running, the most of the chasing. They get really run down. Going into that year, they have really nice sets of antlers. And I'm talking about multi-points. Again, they get run down and they can't recover. And body maintenance then kicks in over antler development and becomes the precedence. And guess what? That next year, they can grow antlers that don't look anything like in terms of size. Maybe shape's very similar, but in terms of size, they could be relatively small, don't rut that hard the next year. Guess what? That following year, their antlers again will be as big or bigger than anything that they produced in the past.
Could that be a condition of a higher buck to doe ratio, lots of bucks, or the increased competition
I've
level?
looked at it. I've looked at it on different places where we had a buck to doe ratio of essentially 1-to-1 and as low as 1-to-7. There's a tendency sometimes where you have those bucks where you have fewer does. I mean, fewer bucks. They don't seem to. They get run down and they don't seem to recover quite as fast.
Yeah.
So that could be an artifact into the situation.
Yeah. Well, I was curious, like what makes besides age, and maybe a little smarts or lack of smarts, what makes a buck decide to rut harder one year versus the other? And yeah, that's interesting.
Well, let's look at it like this way. I'm looking at you two guys and looking at your age. I still love to look at the girls, but I don't chase them as hard as I did, probably as what you did or do, in the last few years. And so that really kind of makes a difference. One of the things we've learned too about the whitetail deer, and I've not had the opportunity to do this with mule deer, but years ago we'd have certain whitetail deer that had huge antlers every year. And yet when we were able to, in some instances, go in and capture those deer, we would run testosterone levels on them. And we found that they were producing just enough testosterone to put them through the antler cycle. But as a result of not having a high testosterone level, they really didn't chase very hard. So those bucks became very sedentary. They didn't run. They didn't get run down. So those were the bucks that when the rut was over with, they were in great body condition, so they were prepared to grow bigger antlers again. If you look at even with mule deer and particularly with whitetail deer, if you go to some of the whitetail shows and you see all these big bucks up on the wall, if you'll notice, a lot of those really outstanding antlered bucks will have little points that are not broken, or they'll have points in areas that if they'd spent any time really rubbing a whole lot or fighting, they'd have probably broken them. Those are probably those bucks that are producing just enough testosterone to keep them going through the antler cycle, but they don't actively chase like some of the other bucks do. As a result, again, they're don't get run down. So when the next year comes around to grow big antlers, they grow big antlers again.
So real quick on that, how do you hunt those bucks other than dumb luck just coming across them? Because
You know
you
what?
know,
I want to back up a little bit on that. Years ago, I had a property that I took care of. It was a high fence, and I used it as a research area as much as anything. We produced some really outstanding whitetail deer on that place because all they wanted to eat was there every day. You know, everything was right as far as the deer were concerned. And we found that when those deer got to be 4.5 years of age, they become very nocturnal. Now, this goes back before we had all the trail cameras things that we did. So I spent a tremendous amount of time out there every night, and those bucks would be almost totally nocturnal. The 4-year-old deer, and particularly the ones that I was just describing, I could find them at night with a light almost any night, and I'd tell the hunters about them. Of course, they'd hunt their tail off, and they would not even believe finally that there were any sizable deer on that property. And so I would get the local game warden, and we'd go out with them one night, and we'd show them what was there. And to me, those kind of deer, as we just described, the older mature deer, but particularly those that are on a low testosterone level or a lower level, they're extremely hard to hunt. They become very their home range is very small. They're very intimately knowledgeable of everything that goes on in that area. They're more concerned about survival than they are propagation or procreating, and so they're become very hard to hunt. To me, those kind of deer are the most challenging of all of them. And generally, when I have seen them, it has been during the middle part of the day with individual bucks that I knew, and it would be between the hours of 10 o'clock in the morning till about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when they seem to move more so than any other time. And is it a natural thing that they do, or is it that for the most part, most hunters hunt from daylight till about 9 or 10 o'clock, go to the house? You know, if it's the weekend, they got to watch football, or they're going to go meet with their friends and talk about what they've seen and not seen. And in about 2:30, they head back to the deer stand, you know, or to the deer woods. Well, have we taught those deer that the chances of a hunter being in the woods during the middle part of the day, they're pretty slim, you know, so they get up and move around a little bit, stretch a little bit more, and get up and feed. So, you know, is it that, or is it a natural deal that naturally occurs? I think it's a little bit of both, because I've also had the opportunity to spend time on some of our bigger ranches in deep South Texas where hunting pressure was either did not exist, they didn't hunt the property, or it was so very low that it was only hunted maybe a week out of the entire year kind of thing. And I saw some of that same movement of really big older mature bucks during that midday time period.
Would you see that overlap with elk as well?
I've hunted elk. I've shot a lot of elk, but I've not had the time to spend with elk like I have. I've spent more time with mule deer. Uh, I think some mule deer, particularly I've had the opportunity to hunt desert mule deer quite a bit, where we don't have the migratory situation and we have a more a level playing field, if you will, of food, where things don't change that much. And I've seen the same kind of thing there a lot of times with some of those really big, older, mature mule deer during the middle part of the day, seeing them then more so than I found them any other time of the day.
Very interesting. Mark, any other thoughts on antler growth before I move on? Lots, I'm sure. That's okay. They got us all confused. Darnell. Here in elk,
Well,
you see
the
antlers, you
more
freeze.
the more
Sorry,
you
I
get
had
to
you on.
know about them, the less you find out, the less you really know about them. So
I apologize. I had you on mute. I got some selfish things that I'm going to be emailing them some pictures of my deer, seeing what potential I have. But I'll save that till after.
perfect. I love that.
So I had there's a local example that I'm using just for setting up the question, but this has got to be throughout the country, um, and a little bit more well known in parts versus others. But I live in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Small, little, geographically different than anything all the way around it. It's got to be the reason we don't have bears, other than the couple that are accidentals that make their way through. And it took us a long time to have a mountain lion population, a huntable number, and so on. So it's just this geographic little area that's fascinating for many reasons. And so South Dakota State University put together this interesting study because they find out that these whitetails in the Black Hills are there, and I'm going to be careful using the word subspecies because in the science world you got to be careful with that. But it's almost as if they are. They are even from a Euro mount, I can see that that is a hills deer versus a prairie deer. So South Dakota's divided in two by the Missouri River. We have East River, which is farmland, lots of egg. West River is mostly prairie, rolling hills, definitely some egg as well. And then the hills is its own pine forest, grassy meadows, all that beautiful stuff. So they did this research project where they took a fawn from the Black Hills and they took one from East River, South Dakota. So the two extremes. The body size of these eastern South Dakota deer are huge. They're the Minnesota deer, the Iowa deer, same. They're huge, and it's you get that pure Allen effect. Is that right? The right term for that? Allen effect. The further north you get, the bigger body, or to
It's
a
actually
point.
Bergman's rule, but that
Bergman's
yes,
rule. Okay, I was off. But it all aligns elsewhere, but in the hills it's off. Small bodies, shorter rostrums on their skulls, smaller little basket racks. They just don't get as big, and on the prairie you can just tell. And so they took that fawn from the Black Hills and they raised it in a very controlled situation with one from East River, and the hills one grew up to be small, and the prairie one grew up to be large. The next generation was a different story. They grew up to be about where the equivalent to an East River one because it had to deal with the maternal uh, nutrition that the mom was getting. And so this study is it's 2011. I want to say that study was done, but it just keeps coming back in my brain and it perplexes me every time I think about it. Um, the prairie around the hills is not, I would say, um, that much different from the Black Hills in that it is grassland. There's grasses. Um, in the Black Hills, it's very green and lush. We get tall grasses in the hills. And obviously, East River, you get all this corn and grain and all kinds of stuff where they're growing big. So those East River and West River deer might have a little size difference, but not crazy. But not till you get into the hills that you get this massive size difference. The habitat is confusing me. Why are these deer so small? Uh, and so different, and I just don't understand it.
I think an adaptation to what's available to them from a nutritional perspective, going back to this daily nutrition kind of thing as opposed to seasonal nutrition. We've seen the same thing in Texas. In Texas we have, depending on who you talk to, numerous subspecies or numerous large family groups, kind of thing. Depending on, I guess, on your perspective. The deer in the brush country of South Texas, again, where we had a very level playing field on, for the most part, lacking somewhat in terms of energy. Those deer would field dress, say, 170 So they were 200-pound deer. You could come up into a little bit along the coastal areas, and those particular deer there would field dress maybe 100 pounds. You go a little bit another way, and they would field dress less than that. And basically, of course, you're dealing with pretty much the same climate, if you will, temperature wise, but rainfall was really different. Therefore, food and the species of plants that were there are totally different as well too. So I think that's kind of an adaptation based upon long-term food. Now, the potential is there for those deer to grow bigger in time. To back that up, even with the human species. Years ago, I spent time in the Arctic banded snow geese with the local Inuit. Those local Inuit, the most part that were 40 years old or older, were 5 foot tall. They were very slightly built. Once they introduced nutrition on a day-to-day basis with a variety of nutrition, it was not uncommon for the 20 and 25-year-old guys to be 6 foot tall. So even though it seemed to a lot of people that it was a genetic thing, uh, maybe it wasn't a genetic thing after all, because that same bunch of people, once they had an opportunity to get on a good nutritional basis, started growing much bigger. So I suspect it's just an adaptation of that particular area of those deer to that particular area, dealing with the food availability that's there, the temperature is there, the climate, and that kind of thing.
So I like to say I'm 6 inches taller than anyone in my family, so there must be something about my diet working for me here. I just bought some Oreos at the grocery stores, and I think that's gonna do it. Uh, it's just the body size alone just had me so confused, and even the antler shape. The antler
Yeah,
shape,
it becomes you've got but it's almost it's you get this isolated population building, so you have
yep.
a tendency to concentrate certain genes. It doesn't mean that there aren't genetics there for big antlers. Maybe they've never had the opportunity to manifest themselves because of nutrition, but they have a tendency to very, very much look alike. I've seen that same thing in specific areas of Texas, to where somebody could go bring you a deer, and you could tell them pretty much almost what ranch that deer came from by the way they looked and their body size and their body shape. And same thing dealing with states. I can tell you the difference between an eastern Colorado white-tailed deer and one that's from Kansas or Nebraska just by very, very quick looking at it, even though they're somewhat everything being equal. But it's amazing how in specific areas populations adapt to what's available to them. Doesn't mean they can't change, but that's what they manifest themselves of based upon environment.
Fishing like a local isn't just about catching fish. It's about connecting with the environment and the people who call it home. It's about hearing the stories and traditions that have been passed down for generations and sharing unforgettable moments with the people you meet along the way. Fishing like a local is having an experience that stays with you forever. And with Fishing Booker, you can experience it too, no matter where you are. Discover your next adventure on Fishing Booker.
Join Waypoint TV's Great Outdoors Month celebration, presented by Battery Tender, every Tuesday and Sunday in June from 7 to 11 p.m. Eastern. Enjoy fishing and hunting content that will inspire you to get outside, but also to take action in preserving the land and water that allows us to do what we love most. Tuesdays and Sundays in June starting at 7 p.m. Eastern on Waypoint TV, the destination for outdoor entertainment.
And when you had mentioned earlier you were headed to Finland to go hunt a whitetail, I was going to be a little devil's advocate and say, isn't a whitetail? But and I wanted you to prove me way wrong on that, but you already have. Is there other areas of the country that have just stuck out in your brain, like you're saying, where they just have a different attitude, or they have a different something that draws you back to them, for say like Coues deer? I mean, those for sure are going to be, that's drawn a lot of people. They've got that kind of uniqueness to it, and that's well known. Are there other things in the country we're missing? East Coast whitetails, West Coast, like that, have just got their own thing? Because I'll plug the I know you love to rattle, and the Black Hills of South Dakota. If you haven't ever hunted here, rattling in hills deer is outstanding. They respond. I bet you like your Texas deer do. They respond so well, and it is so fun.
I've not hunted your state. I have rattled in your state, though I just happened to be up there and we rattled up whitetail deer. An interesting thing along somewhat of what you're talking about. I used to hunt a fair amount on a ranch in the southern part of Oklahoma. And Oklahoma was kind of the same way. I spent a lot of time in eastern Oklahoma now working with the Choctaw Nation on some of their management programs a little bit. Very graciously even asked me to help a little bit. So those deer are mountain deer there, if you will. And just to the west of those deer are totally different. They act different. They eat different things. They taste differently, all those other kind of things. But there's an area there up north of Dallas-Fort Worth area in Oklahoma that on a big ranch, it's about a 20,000 acre ranch. It is high fence, but there have never been any changes done other than uh, bringing in agriculture. There's a creek bottom that runs pretty much and covers most of the eastern part of that ranch, and the western part are uplands. The deer that you see on the uplands look totally different from what you see down in the river bottoms. And not only that, their antlers are considerably different. Those bucks up on the uplands have a tendency to produce very typical antlers. Very seldom see anything more than a few kicker points. The bucks in that river bottom country will be grossly non-typical most of the time. They come up to basically where the G2 start, and then there's no telling what they're going to do at that point. Now, the interesting thing, the reason I bring that up is an adaptation kind of thing. We couldn't figure out what was going on with those deer. I mean, we looked at it. We looked at DNA. There was no difference in DNA. We looked at this. We looked at that. But most of the antlers in the lower country were messed up, if you will, very nicely non-typical in a lot of different ways. Palmation, kicker points, split tines, just really screwed up antlers in some instances. And so, were the aliens zapping them at a certain point, or was there a cloud or something that came across and hung in that lower valley? We couldn't figure it out until I went up there about the time when those antlers were. This was like in late May, early June kind of thing, into that time frame. And I went into that lower bottom area that had not been up there during that time frame. The horseflies were so ungodly bad you couldn't hardly stand them. And so I started watching some of these bucks, and of course you'd see a buck, and the tips of those growing antlers would just be black with horseflies. And I watched those bucks walk up to trees and try to knock those dead gum horseflies off. And in the process of doing that, they were breaking little bits of antler, little bits of bone, which then turned into these really gross, non-typical antlers that they produced. So it's an interesting thing. It's two totally different areas, no difference in DNA, difference, of course, a little bit in nutrition, no differences in age, but just the shape of the antlers was totally different. But that was an artifact, really, of the number of horseflies that were there. And those bucks were trying to knock those horseflies off, and they were breaking antlers, and it's causing them to grow in all kinds of different directions.
Crazy.
It is.
Unless you'd watched them year round or caught them in that moment, it would have confused you forever.
Well, it took me about 4 years to get up there to finally say, well, I want to see what's going on during the time frame when they're at that growth stage, and that's really what it was. Once we got there, it became very obvious. But until that point, I talked to a lot of the Oklahoma guys, the biologists, and all. They go, man, we have no idea what's going on, but they, like me, tried to stay out of that river bottom. And since that time, I make it a point not to go up there to that river bottom during that time of the year when those horseflies were that bad.
Oh my gosh, crazy.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, like you take one of those bucks, take one of the fawns before they grow a rack, and you put that into like the high plains area, it would grow a typical rack then?
Probably just simply because of the fact that it is the horseflies more so than anything else that were causing this. The constant biting and trying to knock it off.
Yeah.
There would be an occasional year where it was and I can't remember the specifics. There was one month, seemed like if you didn't have a whole lot of rain that month, the horseflies weren't as bad as what they were in a normal year. And you would see some misshapen antlers, but not quite to the extent in terms of total number or the severity, if you will, of those years when you had those normal years of extreme high horsefly infestation.
And that's when you get the gnarly ones. I follow. It's pretty interesting.
Tell me, as we brushed on the subspecies discussion or families, where does that sit with you? When you look at, say, 7, 8, 9, whatever they say in the country, but more so you see your typical Maine looking whitetail, but then you have key deer, then you have the Coues deer that are for sure on the outside of that, totally different. Where do you sit on subspecies? Is it a thing? Is there a genetic makeup that is different? Or I
A subspecies is generally the adaptation of a particular species to a specific area in terms of climate, food, and those kind of things. When you get right down to where they develop in that one particular area, so that they're somewhat isolated, kind of like what you're talking about there in the Black Hills. To me, yeah, if you wanted to, you could probably call that a subspecies. And so, how many subspecies are there? God only knows. To me, there's probably at least 10 to 20 very distinctively differently looking, I should say,
Mhm.
whitetail deer that I've encountered across the country. And I've been fortunate enough hunted whitetail. I have not hunted Columbian blacktail out there in Oregon and Washington, but I've been out there to look at them. And again, that to me is an isolated, somewhat population that's become a subspecies because it is isolated.
Hmm. Yeah,
So I'd say there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 plus subspecies of what I would consider legitimate subspecies of whitetail deer in North America. And I'm talking about from Texas on up, not going down into the tropics and all that other kind of thing, because those are totally different deer as well, too.
Going back to some antler growth, I had an important question that has been bugging me as well. On Christmas, we get bucks that start to shed antlers, and then we see bucks all the way into March, holding well into March, holding on to their antlers. We see a lot more consistency, I think, with elk and a shorter window, it seems like. But what determines, and it's probably a broken record here, I can only assume condition, but a lot of those bucks are going through the same conditions in that one season, and yet we have this huge shedding window of when they're dropping their antlers. What have you seen in your controlled settings that have contributed to the big ranges of drop in antlers?
In controlled settings, we've had bucks that we've had years ago doing wildlife disease research. We had a bunch of deer in pens, and including bucks, and a lot of times under ideal nutrition conditions, not getting run down because of the rut, that buck would shed his antlers every day within a 2-day period every year, year after year. When we started playing with other deer in a pen situation from a research perspective, where we really had maybe one buck with 20 does, and then we might have that buck got run down and his antlers generally came off sooner. Then we also played around with nutrition to where we restricted their nutrient intake in terms of volume, but also in terms of quality. And those antlers had a tendency to come off quicker than those ones that are in the pen right next to them, if you will, that were, maybe brothers, could have been out of the same doe or sired by the same buck. Sometimes body condition can make a lot of difference. Those under a stressed body condition have a tendency to drop their antlers sooner. Those that are in a good nutritional condition have a tendency a lot of times to hold their antlers a little bit longer. So it really kind of comes down to a genetic thing, a nutrition thing. what's interesting about dropping antlers, until that antler is ready to drop off, maybe an hour and ahead of time, you could walk up to it with a baseball bat and hit it, and it wouldn't fall off. And yet, 20 minutes later, it drops. It's that abscission line that controls that, and it happens when it happens. It happens immediately. Sometimes it happens, of course, where both antlers are cast at the same time, and sometimes I've seen a buck carry one of his antlers for almost a month before he dropped the second one. And interestingly, when they started growing, they developed, once they got covered up by velvet, they developed at about the same rate. But I think with the shedding, it's probably more so condition of that individual animal. Uh, you might have 10 bucks and all of them are pretty much on pretty much the same kind of diet and all that thing, but one of them, for whatever reason, doesn't assimilate energy as well as the other does, or that buck gets hit by some minor little disease. Maybe it's like almost like a cold or something like that, and he gets in a weakened condition, and chances are he's going to drop those antlers a little bit quicker than he would otherwise.
Can you see that any signs of that health or stress, say like in the pedicle or the burr, or like anything like?
Well, there's some research that's been done recently that, and I've not had a chance to really look at it, but according to that research, if you find a shed antler where the pedicle is convex, so it's bulged out, they're saying that those animals are healthier, and those antlers are on a better nutrition condition, whereas those that are on a and I might have it screwed up here. Where they're kind of dished out or flat. Those have a tendency, well, the pedicle is that way and it's convex and concave being in. Those antlers that are convex, where they stick out, they say are in better body condition, as opposed to those that are flat or concaved in a little bit. And I've looked at a bunch of shed antlers. I love picking up shed antlers, and I've been able to pick up sheds on the same buck year after year after year. I've not seen those kind of differences on the deer that I've dealt with, but there is research now that I think it's done somewhere maybe in Mississippi or the Southeast.
Yeah, wasn't there Oklahoma study or something too on the depth of it? I
Maybe
remember.
maybe it was Oklahoma. I can't remember exactly where.
Huh.
But to me, based on, bucks that I've been able to follow for years, and in certain instances, I've had the opportunity to work with places that were high fenced and using those as a research area where I could really kind of study individual bucks kind of thing. I have not seen that difference from year to year.
Yeah, I'd be curious to
But
know.
on those bucks, they do have a tendency, again, if they're on a good nutritional level, they tend to drop those antlers nearly on the same day every year.
That's crazy. And so shed hunters, that's probably a good note to take of you find a good buck, better be shed hunting within those couple of days.
The interesting thing about sheds is too, I mean, you can learn so much from them as far as I'm concerned. But we were talking earlier about these deer that don't have a high testosterone level.
Mm-hmm.
To me, if you can find those kind of antlers that we're talking about that don't have broken points, that are pretty darn perfect, that's probably one of those, and they're big, and that's probably one of those animals that had just enough testosterone to put them through the cycle, all that kind of stuff. I have shot several of those kind of deer, either me or somebody that I was guiding or somebody that I've dealt with on the ranch. A lot of times we've shot those bucks that dropped those antlers within less than 100 yards of where we found the shed antler.
Fascinating. The Is there any that you can think of or know of or seen any, and it's back to still that depth of that pedicle,
Right.
as that blood flow cuts off and those cells eventually, it's almost like scab over and it rejects that antler and off it goes. The Do you see that being maybe some with the part that is dying? I'm trying to think of how this would be. You know how some of those antlers just like, how did that thing survive? That thing's so far in there, probably bled like a stuck pig, versus other ones that how is that thing even holding on to there? Or there must be this big old chunk there at the top. Do you know what side of that? Does that make any sense?
It's both sides. Essentially, what happens is that abscission line that's created. It's almost like if you pick an antler up and you scratch it right after, it's almost like there's a little cartilage on it.
Mhm.
There's a little bit of tissue there. That's that abscission line. It's been solidified. But when that testosterone drops to a certain level, that abscission line releases itself. That's what that, and then the antler falls off, and then of course almost immediately it starts growing over the top of it again. But there is a small abscission line there that where all the little jagged edges come together on both sides. It releases that abscission line dissolves essentially, and that's when the antler comes off.
Well, thanks for making a question out of my rambling thoughts.
Once that antler is totally developed and the velvet comes off, what happens is it's all testosterone level determined. There's a shot of testosterone at the end of antler development to where it constricts those blood vessels going into those antlers, and the velvet would come off at that point. It would peel off whether they rub it off or not, but they do rub it off. At that point, there's no longer any blood or anything going into the antler. And it's not until that abscission line separates. And again, it's so interesting because we had pit bucks, and I knew which day they were going to drop, and I knew about which time they dropped, like at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I'd go out there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'd grab those horns and I'd start shaking them, trying to knock them off there. I could not do it. And yet all of a sudden, right about at that magic moment of 2 o'clock that afternoon, you could walk up there and just barely touch an antler and it fall off.
That explains why you have antlers that are going to go land on each other.
Yes.
And
yes.
Versus some, but it doesn't explain, I guess, when one held on to the one for so long.
No. And maybe there's some injury that we cannot see, that where there's a certain nerve that damaged that helps control that abscission line. That causes it has to regenerate. I don't know. I mean, I really don't. Antler development as a whole, as you mentioned, is the second fastest growing tissue to some tumors or some cancers. And years ago, we did a lot of work with the Mayo Clinic up in was it Rochester, Minnesota, or someplace up there.
Yep.
Looking at why does this bone grow this fast? Because they were looking at it, goes, oh my God, think about this. If you had a broken bone and you could inject with whatever that is at the site where that bone is broken, it could regenerate in 2 days. Well, they did a tremendous amount of research. We did a lot of research on antler. We still haven't come up with anything like that. And as far as I know, nobody else has either. But it grows unbelievably quickly. And you mentioned elk and even moose. You can sit there, and if you can have that animal hold its head still long enough, you can actually see the antlers growing. And you can do that with some of the white-tailed deer as well, too. And I've done it a little bit with mule deer, where they were just laying there for a long time, and you could just sit there and concentrate, and you could see those tiny little hairs on that velvet move as they grew.
Oh,
it's
man.
Amazing how quickly it grows.
That's incredible. Big picture question. Let's say this would never happen, especially with Colorado's governor, but Colorado Governor Polis comes and asks you, he said, Mr. Larry, I need you to bring back the 1970s and 80s mule deer into Colorado. Funny setting this up. What is your grand scale plan to bring back those 70s and 80s mule deer that just we had 190s and 200-inch bucks and the old world records coming out of Colorado? Like what is it that Colorado is lacking now, or there's too many people like me out there shooting them? I don't know. What's your management plan if you were tasked with that or you get to the chopping block? You had to do something. But Mark's got to head out here, so thanks, Mark.
Okay, I'll very quickly answer this.
No, I'm here for good.
Okay, a lot of you guys out there listening are going to hate me, and some of you are going to love me. There are two things that I would do. Number one, I would do a massive predator control program. Secondly, I would reduce the elk herd to considerably less than what it is right now. Uh, Elk just can outcompete. This ranch that I was talking about up in the northwest corner of Colorado, when I first started working with it years ago, there were virtually no elk in that area. The mule deer that we had were huge. I mean, there were numerous bucks that were taken that were could be in the book if they wanted to. Shooting a 180 to 190 buck was not that uncommon. Killing one or two 200s on that property that year, in a year, was not that uncommon. And they were not hunted very heavily, and it was a big ranch. It was controlled in terms of numbers of hunters that came in. There were no elk. Over a period of about a 10-year period of dealing with that ranch, we saw that property have no elk to huge elk herds. And as that elk herd greatly increased, you saw the numbers and the quality of the mule deer greatly reduced, to where there's still mule deer there, but they're not there in the numbers that they were in the past. Coupled the elk with their ability to eat a lot of different things that mule deer don't, along with the length of their legs, the really cold, bad weather that we had in some of those areas in terms of deep snows, the elk could reach food and ate higher than what the mule deer could. So there's, to me, based on my observations on that ranch and a few other places I've had the opportunity to deal with, where we've had both elk and mule deer, if we greatly increase the elk herds, our mule deer population greatly suffered. So, yes, I think if we could control the predators to where we would greatly increase our fawn survival rates, and and winters, of course, have been a big kicker in some of these areas. There's some areas up in Wyoming just above there that had no fawn survival rate the last couple of years due to the really cold weather and the depth of snow and the number of predators. And but if we could increase our numbers of fawns that survive and get them into those little bit older age classes, you would see a lot more of those older, bigger bucks that they did back in the future. But you would have to do it in the presence also of increased nutrition, which again might mean the reduction of that elk herd.
Hmm. That's a fascinating answer. Uh, would your answer change if I asked you this? For I'm active with our Mule Deer Foundation
Right.
locally, and we are always doing or looking for various projects and things, and fence removal is one of those common go-to projects.
Right.
What else? What are some of those projects you've seen for mule deer that have been successful or really worth putting chapter dollars into?
I love the corridors that have been created, and some of the underpasses, overpasses, the fences, all those kind of things. A lot of that country that y'all are in is a thirsty country. A lot of the mule deer live in a thirsty country, if you will, and by that I mean there is not a great amount of water. On a lot of the cattle operations, they may have water troughs, but when they rotate cattle out of those areas, a lot of them cut the water troughs off. So there's a lack of water. We've seen that happen pretty much in mule deer, and I've dealt a lot with mule deer in New Mexico and a little bit in Colorado, as I mentioned, but also in western Texas and the Trans-Pecos and the Texas Panhandle. And water becomes a very critical thing. So very often, as I said, if the rancher has water troughs, when he moves his cattle out, he shuts the water off. So I think we've had good success with establishing the guzzlers type of things in Western habitats to where you can provide water to those animals on a daily basis. But when you do that too, with the number of predators that we have in terms of coyotes and mountain lion, guess what? Those predators learn too that those are food plots, if you will, for them as well too. So
Yeah.
to me, it's got to be coupled with predator control. Now, I'm not opposed to having predators. Believe me, I love the fact that we have predators, but at the same time, they need to be controlled to where everything benefits and not just one species, as has kind of been the case in Colorado, particularly. They'll pick one species and go, okay, we got to do this, this, this. Well, in the process of that, you disturb a lot of things and cause a lot of problems with the other species that are there as well too. Uh, to me, like the mountain lion situation that you guys are looking at in Colorado, the black bear situation, we should have never done away with the spring bear hunts.
Mhm.
Doing so is totally idiotic as far as I'm concerned. And some of the programs that now being done, particularly with the wolf introduction. And I'll tell you something, since I've got you, I'm all for
Yeah.
the reintroduction of wolves, mountain lions, and grizzly bears. And I think that they should be released in Denver, uh, maybe a couple of other towns in Colorado, but of
Boulder.
course, naturally in Sacramento, in Los Angeles, and a whole lot of the other large cities. I mean, you look at California. This is the Western Staff podcast. What's on the flag in California? A
Uh,
grizzly bear. You know, we need to be releasing grizzly bears in what was former grizzly bear habitat, and that includes downtown Los Angeles.
there you
So,
go.
am I in favor of it? Absolutely. Let's put them where they want to see them. Let's let them experience them like those folks who live out in the country and have to deal with them, how they experience with them as well.
They want their Estes Park, Yellowstone petting zoo feel, and
Yeah,
uh,
let them have it.
yeah, yeah. There's an Instagram page called Nature is Metal,
Yes,
and
sir.
it, they quite often show how disastrous and rough and I often have this conversation with new hunters that struggle with the idea of maybe taking a life for the first time, and it often ends up with, well, are they going to get old and sick and get torn apart by a coyote? Are they going to be torn apart by a coyote as a fawn? Are they going to be it all ends up eventually with not a really great way of going.
Right.
And it'd be like us without any medicine, no doctors, nothing. It just would be rough, and that's part of nature.
It is.
That's why
It is.
God made it. Um, it-
It is.
and he gave those animals ways of coping with it the same way. Maybe not a conscious like what we have, conscience and so on. But who knows?
It is. You're right.
Um, yeah, that's a we'll get that on the ballot. Apparently, you only need 175,000 signatures, and away you go. And I bet
Yeah. Why not have it on the ballot that we want to release them in Los Angeles, or Denver?
Denver, yeah, they got their one street, a bunch of animals running around there anyway, downtown by the Rocky where the Rocky Stadium is. So that's that's ground zero right there. I'm gonna get that rolling. That's funny. So and this transitions into my last question very well. You have seen, I'm sure, a huge change in Western hunting and what that has looked like, the attraction, people, Eastern hunters going west and now Western hunters going east and vice versa. But what's the future of Western hunting look like in your eyes? What has you concerned? What has you excited? What that or do we just have a concern of hunting in general? Like what's your concern with what you've seen over the last few decades?
I think a big concern is hunting. I think a big concern is such as what happened in Colorado, putting different initiatives on the ballot, and those ballots or those elections or whatever, those situations be voted on by the general public who has no understanding of wildlife. We've removed ourselves as a population in the U.S. from the land. Very few people have a connection to the land anymore, as we did just like one generation ago, and that's really scary to me because uh, those folks have no idea. A lot of them don't even know really where food comes from. COVID taught a few people that unfortunately it was bad, but at the same time, it taught people that hey, food comes from someplace beside a grocery store. And to me, the positive things that I see are the locavore movement that we have of people who are becoming very, very interested in procuring their own meat, their own vegetables, if you will, their own fish. I think that's a really important thing as far as I'm concerned, moving into the future kind of thing. The future of hunting across the country, and particularly in the West, the scary part is that initiative that some people have the ability to put on the ballot and the public decide, rather than letting somebody who has an understanding about wildlife and how important hunting is to the perpetuation of all species, and maybe more importantly, the habitat itself when you get right down to it. That's the scary part, as far as I'm concerned. On those in those states where they don't have that, I see a lot rosier picture moving in the future. Is it going to be like we were back in the 60s or whatever? Probably not, because of the habitat that we had back in the 60s and the attitudes that we had in the 60s don't exist that way anymore. So, but will hunting go away in a lot of these states? I don't think so. Now, there may be a few states, again, going back to this initiative thing, where we could wake up one morning and Colorado says, okay, not only are we not going to hunt these species, you're not going to hunt any species in the future. And I have a statement that I make quite often: conservation promotes life. Conservation is the wise use of. Preservation kills. When you try to preserve one particular species, it has an effect on everything that's there. I've been able to work with properties in the past where we had all kinds of habitat situations. And when we started working on a hunting program where an animal was economically important to that landowner or to that uh, land owner entity, whether it's public or not. When we did that, we worked to where we were trying to achieve a healthy deer herd, healthy elk herd, healthy bighorn herd, healthy turkey populations. When we did that, we increased the variety of the species that were there in terms of vegetation. When you increase the variety of species and vegetation, everything benefits. The songbirds benefit, the insects benefit. And all that comes right back down to having a good hunting program to perpetuate a game species or a series, several game species. When you do that and do it properly in terms of trying to improve the habitat through hunting, of removing what nature can exist with without affecting that population negatively, then you have a very great positive effect on all the species that are there.
Very good. I wrote that quote down. I like that very much. And I can't agree more. I have a new hunter program that I run through the game fishing parks up here, that I put them through an application process, and I ask them of why are you interested in learning to hunt? And it's adult,
Perfect.
it's kids, but usually, and I don't accept just kids. I need you to be 12 and over with your parents. So
Excellent.
I need, or a guardian. So I get the whole family involved. That's what R3 is shown to be most effective. Target those 18 to 36-year-olds. And then the families come right along with that. And 99% of the reasons for that question right there is, I'd like to procure my own food. I'm
Yes.
interested in, and you do get the doomsdayers that say, I want to get it unless it hits the fan. I need to know how to do it. Or, but there's just, they want to know where their food comes from. They want to do that. And it is overwhelmingly, it's like they're reading from the same book, writing the same answer on 90 people over the last 130 people over the last 3 years that I've run through that program, that answer the same answer over and over again, and it's fascinating. And the Advanced Council for Shooting Sports, if I got that right, they just put out their report that hunting is steady across the west, or not just the west, the country. Things
Right.
looking steady, and a little bit of climb here, a little bit of decline there, but steady. Decline being in the California states, which the hunters are leaving, so that's probably why, and coming to places like South Dakota, Texas, and Florida, but
Yes.
and every other state they can find, anywhere Governor Newsom is not, but so yeah, very interesting to see that, and I like seeing the words put to that. So, but Larry, I appreciate your time so much. You're an absolute treat and honor to chat with. I'm a bit of an introvert at times, but man, I could sit down and have a drink with you and chat your ear off
Let's
for
plan on doing that.
hours. So I would love to do that someday. And if you're not putting in for some preference points in South Dakota here, it cost you $10 for the Black Hills. You want to rattle in some Black Hills deer up here? Oh, put it on your list.
I'll have to put it back on there. I was on the list a few years ago, and I kind of got away from it, so I need to do that. And while I've got you and your listeners, I'm very involved with the Dallas Safari Club, and DSC is going to have their convention this year in the early week or first part of January down at Atlanta. And fortunately, they're tearing down the Kay Bailey Hutchinson Center there in Dallas where we've had it. But that organization does so very much for hunters, not only here in North America, but across the world. And it's a great source of education as well, too. And through our DSC Foundation, we help provide funds, if you will, through grants to groups like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, specifically the Mule Deer Foundation, Wild Sheep Foundation, and a whole bunch of others. So people can learn more about DSC by just going to their website, which is biggame.org. And I think they'll be glad they did.
Yeah, awesome. Anything else you want to share that you're working on, your podcast, book?
Well, I appreciate that.
That's always my closing. I love to hear what people got going on.
We've got a lot going on, actually. I do a weekly podcast as well called DSC's Campfires with Larry Weishuhn. It's available on Spotify, and it's available on Apple and most all the other platforms that are out there. And do a weekly TV show that's on Carbon TV's Advanced Sportsman's Life. That it's really real world hunting. We do hunting, fishing, what's kind of going on. The shows are the hunts and fishing are done one week, and usually the next week they appear. And been working on some books. Just put 2 new books out. One's called Campfire Talk, and the other one's called Deer Addictions, which is about hunting deer across North America. And just finished another one that will be out very shortly called Poor Man's Grizzly, which is about hunting wild hogs that you probably do not yet have, but there are 2 types of country in North America, them what's got them and them what's going to get them kind of thing.
Yeah.
So doing that, and just designed 2 knives for a company out in Washington, a little company called Silver Stag that we're getting ready to release. And they can learn more about all that kind of stuff, plus read blogs and hear the podcast and see the TV show and all those other things at my website, which is lowercase all www.larryweishuhn.net, and invite them to go there. And there's no telling what they'll find there, but I do a lot of blogs as well too. So I try to post at least 2 to 4 new blogs every month.
Holy smokes, you're busy. You got a lot of projects going.
I'll stay that way.
Keeps us young. I enjoy it as well. So thank you so much, Larry.
Oh my God. Thank you.
Pleasure.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so very much for allowing me to be on your podcast.
Absolutely.
But it ain't my ground. This is God's country.
Oh my God! Every once in a while, it's fun to go like just full-blown redneck on these fish. This is like high-tech cane pole fishing right here.
From the white sandy beaches to the crystal blue waters, enjoy the best fishing Panama City Beach has to offer during Chasing the Sun. Sundays at 9:30 a.m. Eastern on Waypoint TV, the destination for outdoor entertainment. Join Waypoint TV and LG channels in celebrating Great Outdoors Month, presented by Battery Tender. Tune in every Tuesday and Sunday in June, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern. Channel 109 on your LG Smart TV. You can also watch Waypoint TV at lgchannels.com.